So part of the panel was meant to deal with the HPV vaccines. Namely, is there any objective evidence to show that the current HPV vaccine program is not justified, and what is the evidence that, if any, that HPV vaccines prevent cervical cancer and therefore can offer long-term benefit, because that's the basis that they're being promoted as cervical cancer vaccines. And also briefly to touch on the nature and incidence of adverse events. So briefly, again, what the clinical trials for HPV vaccines have shown is that they can prevent some portion of lesions caused by HPV 16 and 18 viruses. And so obviously it was deduced from that it's likely that they will prevent cervical cancer. And the issue is, can someone make such a leap in a conclusion? Well, this is Diane Harper, who lead most clinical trials on both HPV vaccines, Cervarix and Gardasil, and she made a point that's often overlooked, which is that the natural progression of cervical cancer from infection to cancer is actually very slow. That allows ample time for treatment, and most of the infections actually resolve by themselves, and only a very little proportion goes on to cancer. So here 90% of HPV infections resolve on their own within 3 years. And it's interesting to note that Merck actually obtained licensure from the FDA based on their initial trials that were only 3 years in duration. So it's unclear whether the vaccine did anything other than speed up the clearing of something that would have cleared up without vaccine. This was an early editorial in JAMA. Again, same issue was raised, that how can anyone know that the HPV vaccine given to a teenager can actually protect cancer, cervical cancer, which comes from an infection that in few cases will cause cancer 20 to 40 years from now. And this was basically the longest duration of the trials for both vaccines. And it has been estimated, again, this is by Diane Harper, that HPV vaccines must maintain their efficacy for at least 15 years to contribute to the prevention of cervical cancer. And to this date, we don't have any such long-term clinical data. And this is again from a paper published by Diane Harper, where it has been shown that since the implementation of PAP screening programs, the cervical cancer incidence has fallen dramatically. And for example, in the US, there is about 8 to 100,000 women will develop the disease in every year. And there is only 1 to 2 cases of mortality per 100,000. Now, obviously, one wants to prevent every case. But the question is, can the HPV vaccine reduce the incidence of cervical cancer beyond what has been already achieved by PAP screening? And the answer to that is most likely no. These figures were based on modeling assumption that the efficacy will last for a lifetime. So this is actually best case scenario. And it shows that basically 9.5 or 9 women in 100,000 would develop cervical cancer with Cervarix and 14 with Gardasil. Now, why these numbers? Well, the HPV vaccine, first of all, don't cover all oncogenic strains, and it's pretty nearly impossible to vaccinate every single girl under the sun. Now, Diane Harper has also mentioned that combining screening with vaccination is not expected to significantly lower the number of women getting cervical cancer, and that this may not be the information that will influence increased vaccine uptake, but physicians' goals are not to sell vaccine products. Now, this is a very reasonable statement, unlike some that we had seen from the vaccine manufacturer. This was a paper by 2 German doctors, and they made the same point, that this initial unwarranted, they said unwarranted confidence in the new HPV vaccines has led to the impression that there was no need to evaluate their effectiveness. And what is so disturbing is that the health regulatory authorities have simply jumped on the bandwagon with not so accurate advertising of the vaccine manufacturers and claim these outrageous numbers, 100% protection against cervical cancer or other HPV-related diseases. And so decision at the policy level might have been misled based on that. Now, again, regular Pap screenings have already demonstrated that or demonstrably reduce cervical cancer mortality by almost or more than 70% in developed countries. And HPV vaccines, even if proven effective, are unlikely to reduce what has already been achieved by Pap screening. And there is also a concern that if women who are vaccinated might feel confident that the HPV vaccine is going to do the job, that they will stop doing the regular Pap screen test, in which the cervical cancer might increase, which has already been, there is indication that that is already happening. This is one recent study that shows the effectiveness of HPV trial in Manitoba, Canada, and it's actually pretty interesting results. It was only 3 years in duration, but the numbers are quite different than what we've seen in preclinical trial papers. So in short, they're not that impressive in terms of reduction of lesions. So this is vaccine efficacy in 15 to 17-year-olds. This is over 18-year-olds, and some are even negative efficacy. Or this is cumulative 3-year probability for developing lesions and also carcinoma in situ, and we can see that there's not really much difference between the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated. But we, again, talking about false pharma advertising, or Merck has launched this campaign, One Less, claiming basically that your daughter is going to be one less life affected by cervical cancer, and it's been a very successful campaign. And same, the US American Academy of Pediatrics and the US CDC have claimed that Gardasil is a life-saving vaccine that will, and an important cervical cancer prevention tool now that will potentially benefit the health of millions of women. And again, this is just false advertising because there is simply no proof to make these dogmatic claims. This is a paper from South Asian Journal of Cancer, and the reason why I present it, because one could argue that definitely in developed countries such as US and UK and most of Europe, where we have regular Pap screening programs, cervical cancer deaths are very rare, 1 to 2 cases per 100,000. There is, seriously, even with the best case assumption that the vaccine can maintain efficacy for a lifetime, you would not be able to bring that rate down. But what about countries like India, where cervical cancer is a problem? And this paper was authored by Sudeep Gupta, who is a convener of Gynecology and Oncology Working Group, and editor-in-chief of the Indian Journal of Medical and Pediatric Oncology. And so some few quotes from this paper. Again, it actually has been observed that even in India, cervical cancer rate have declined over the past decades, and that's without any intervention from vaccines. And that for the first time, cervical cancer incident mortality in India has fallen behind that of breast cancer. And again, these are his words, not mine, that one can only imagine a situation where vaccination had been introduced several decades ago and the decline conveniently attributed to this intervention. And this is another point which is often neglected, is that cervical cancer genesis is is a complex process. It's not simply you get the virus and you get the cancer. There are other factors involved, such as risk use of contraceptives, smoking, inflammation, and so forth. And so failure to appreciate that can also lead to misguided conclusions. And the big problem in India is that they don't have a regular screening program. And what this paper concluded is that that's a monumental public health failure, but still not an excuse to mass vaccinate millions of women with vaccines that so far have not lived up to their claims. And the other point was raised that it would be best if vaccine policies would not be made by those who have some ties to the pharma companies. And why am I mentioning that? This is just a pharma-based internet website that just shows you how much money is made by both Gardasil and Cervarix. So this is from 2012. They were among 20 top-selling vaccines. And what was interesting to me is just to read the comment. Basically, they were saying, although the company sales are nothing to scoff at, they can both do better. And they were analyzing that, only a third of girls between 13 and 17 that are the basic target for these vaccines have received it in US, and they said that this leaves a full 2/3 of the available market untapped. So, and this one's from Bloomberg News, and what was interesting to me is that this link was working a year or two ago, but now I cannot access it anymore. It's broken. Wonder why. So this was news from Bloomberg, showing that Merck was counting on Gardasil to help offset the declining sales of their cholesterol pills, and an analyst was saying that Gardasil needs to be doing better because the vaccine has become increasingly more important from profit view because of concerns over these drugs. And this was in the time when Merck was attempting to enlarge the market, because initially the vaccine was only approved for school-age girls. Then they were trying to get it approved for older women, and they were initially unsuccessful with that with US FDA, but then they obtained licensure from Health Canada. And again, this is just a comment that Merck's senior vice president said that they had a number of programs underway to get after these women. So what about the HPV vaccine safety? Well, this is just a paper we published a few years ago showing that if one looks at the US VERS with all its flaws, again, we know that it's a passive reporting system and that anyone can report, but it gives an indication. Again, VERS does not, if someone files a report to US VERS, it doesn't prove that the vaccine caused the reaction, but it gives an indication to pick up potential safety signals. So what we found is that out of all vaccines that are given to that age group, the HPV vaccines accounted for over 60% of serious events reported, deaths and life-threatening, and 80% of reports of permanent disability. This is just a list of autoimmune and immune-related diseases that have been reported following HPV vaccines, quite a big list. And the reason why I highlighted in yellow the last dysautonomia and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndromes and fibromyalgia is because this group seemed to be the most commonly reported. We also published an analysis based on other drug safety monitoring databases or vaccine safety monitoring databases in other countries. And what we have consistently found is that if you rate the number of adverse reactions reported based on organ classes, that nervous system and psychiatric disorders are always the most commonly reported. This data was picked up by some colleagues in Japan, and they have added their data to for Cervarix and Gardasil, and again, same pattern appears. Nervous system and psychiatric disorders rank the highest. And of late, I was able to retrieve data from Denmark and added it to the same graph, and again, same pattern. And so this is more than coincidence, but not everyone believes that. This is a latest report, or very recent, from December 2015 from Heidi Larsson that appeared in Nature, titled "The World Must Accept that HPV Vaccine is Safe." Now, why does the world have to accept that the HPV vaccines are safe? Because the European Medicines Agency says so. And on 20th of November, they issued the result of their panel discussion, which was convened basically to evaluate whether there is any causal link between these dysautonomia syndromes and HPV vaccinations, and they've cleared the vaccine. They said that there are no safety concerns and no need to change the current vaccination policies. And so Heidi Larsson mentioned that the alternative explanation was that these were just psychogenic illnesses and nothing to do with the vaccine. Now, should we trust the European Medicine Agency's reviews? This is a translation from an article that appeared in Denmark that showed that majority of the members of the panel did receive money from the vaccine manufacturer. They helped initially in approving the vaccine, and they promoted it in their countries, and they were a priori determined to exonerate the vaccine. And I will just quote, there were 12 members, I believe. I'll just quote one example of who sat on European Medicine Agency's panel, Margareta Bleno from Karolinska Institute, who said that she called the suspicion against HPV vaccines lies, and said that doctors who express fear of side effects should be stopped, and that the websites that tell negatively on HPV vaccines should be also stopped, and those websites that were favorable should be put up higher on Google. And there is some members of the EU Parliament were concerned about the integrity of the MA panel, and basically, it boggles the mind when one reads the conflicts of interests of all 12 members to see how any meaningful conclusion can be derived from their review. And this is not just opposed by few individuals, but many prominent professionals who have themselves dealt with HPV vaccine victims have raised their voices against the EMA decision. And just a few questions at the end. Is it ethical to put young, healthy women at risk, at risk of many autoimmune disabling diseases that have been reported so far for a vaccine that has, again, not lived up to the claim, and so far we don't know if it can offer any long-term clinical benefit for a disease that is safely preventable through other methods. And I will just conclude here with a statement from Louise Brindt from the syncope unit of Frederiksberg's hospital in Denmark, who has treated hundreds of patients with dysautonomia-like syndromes post-HPV vaccines. And she made a point how, again, it is a subset of girls that react. Not everyone reacts. And so more likely than not, there may be some genetic susceptibility. And this is not only being recognized in this issue of HPV vaccine, but in vaccination issues in vaccine response in general. And this is why we are talking more increasingly about vaccinogenomics and personalized vaccinomic. And so this may clash with the current paradigm of one-size-fits-all that underlies most vaccination programs worldwide. And so where does that leave us when science is beginning to contradict our old ways that are so established? And Louis said, I have no answer, but except that the denial is unlikely to be the right way forward. So again, this was just briefly to show that the HPV vaccines concerns are legit, and they don't come from anti-science, anti-vaxxers people. So I will leave it at that.